December 22nd, 1944. The forests of the Ardennes were wrapped in silence, their tall pines dusted with snow that swallowed sound. Beneath a low, clouded moon, 4 men worked beside a Sherman tank half buried in white. The air was sharp and bitter, their breath hanging like ghosts as they brushed thick black paint across the tank's cold steel. Every motion was deliberate, cautious. The brush strokes sounded like whispers in the dark. Somewhere beyond the trees, German engines growled faintly. Convoys moving east to west along a frozen road, hauling fuel and ammunition toward the front. The American crew knew they'd be here soon. Sergeant William Bill Hanley, the tank commander, checked his watch under the dim red glow of a covered flashlight. 03:17 hours. They had less than an hour before dawn. He ordered his men to move faster, not in panic but in quiet urgency. They'd scavenged the black paint from a destroyed depot, meant for vehicles, not camouflage. But tonight it was survival. Around them the forest was a graveyard of snow and silence. The men could hear only the soft drip of melting frost and the creak of tank metal contracting in the cold. Their Sherman, once an olive-drab silhouette easy to spot against the white hills, now disappeared into shadow. Black on white, invisible at first glance. Hanley stepped back, breathing through his scarf, and studied the tank's form. The overcast sky, the smoke, the night, it blended perfectly. It wasn't standard procedure. It wasn't in any manual. But manuals hadn't kept men alive these past weeks. This was the winter of the Bulge, when the German counterattack had torn through American lines and the war in Europe had plunged into chaos. Entire divisions had been scattered. Fuel was scarce, the roads frozen, and no one knew who held the next ridge or village. In that confusion, survival belonged to those who could adapt faster than the enemy. The crew finished their work in silence. They climbed inside, closed the hatches, and waited. The paint would dry by the time the first light crept through the trees. Then they would wait for the German convoy. In the stillness, Hanley could hear his heartbeat echo through the steel hull, steady, unshaken. This wasn't bravery. It was calculation. And as the horizon began to pale in the east, he whispered to himself, "Now we'll see if this madness works." The convoy was coming. Their ambush was set, and the night was about to turn black with fire. By December 1944, the Western Front had turned into a frozen chessboard of chaos. The Allied advance that had seemed unstoppable after Normandy was now locked in the bitter struggle of the Ardennes, a vast, forested region stretching across Belgium and Luxembourg, where the dense woods and narrow roads choked movement and masked entire armies. Hitler had gambled everything on one last offensive. The goal, drive a wedge through the Allied lines, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before Germany's collapse became irreversible. It was called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. But for the soldiers caught in it, it became known by another name, the Battle of the Bulge. American units were scattered, undersupplied, and often surrounded. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Snowstorms blinded pilots and muffled artillery fire. At Bastogne, American paratroopers held on against overwhelming odds. Further north, fuel convoys struggled to reach frontline tanks. Every drop of gasoline became a prize. Every stretch of road, a battlefield. For Sergeant Hanley's small Sherman crew, their orders were simple but suicidal. Delay a German supply convoy moving through a narrow forest route near the town of Trois-Ponts. No reinforcements, no artillery cover, just 1 tank and 4 men. Their only advantage was deception. The Sherman was never meant for stealth. Its high silhouette made it a perfect target for German 88s, but the snow, fog, and night offered what armor could not, invisibility. Hanley's decision to cover the tank in black paint was born from desperation. The darkness would break the tank's outline against the forest shadows, making it appear like part of the terrain until the Germans were almost upon them. Across the forest, the German columns pushed west, Tiger tanks, Panzer IVs, and endless trucks carrying ammunition, fuel, and wounded. But even their success brought danger. Every mile advanced deepened their dependence on supply lines that were thin and exposed. American patrols had begun targeting them in small, savage ambushes, delaying tactics that inflicted fear more than destruction. Hanley's unit was one of many improvising these tactics, turning terrain and timing into weapons. The cold had dulled everything, sound, color, even fear. But it sharpened one truth. This battle would not be won by strategy alone. It would be won by endurance. And in the frozen stillness, endurance meant waiting. Waiting for engines. Waiting for headlights. Waiting for the moment to strike first. As dawn began to faintly bleed through the clouds, Hanley listened to the distant hum of trucks approaching, slow, heavy, and unaware. Their moment had come. Inside the cramped steel belly of the Sherman, the world was nothing but the hum of machinery, the rattle of breath and the faint sting of oil and gunpowder in the air. The M4 Sherman was never a comfortable machine. It was loud, hot in summer, freezing in winter, and always on the edge between survival and destruction. But for the men who crewed her, she was home weapon and coffin all at once. Sergeant Bill Hanley had been fighting since Normandy. He was 32 but looked 50. The war had carved lines into his face that no peace could erase. He had seen tanks burn, friends vanish, and villages flattened into silence. Yet his calm under pressure had earned him a reputation, the kind of commander who could make impossible decisions without raising his voice. Beside him sat Corporal Frank Delaney, the gunner, wiry, sharp-eyed from Detroit. He had worked on factory machines before the war, and the 75mm cannon was just another precision instrument to him. Below, Private Red Turner loaded shells with quiet focus. He never spoke much, but every round he handled was placed with near ritual care. At the driver's seat, Corporal Joe Ramirez from Texas kept his gloved hands ready on the controls, whispering prayers between clenched teeth. They had been together for nearly a year, moving from one campaign to another, hedgerows, river crossings, frozen towns. In a war that devoured men by the hour, their survival was an anomaly. But survival, they knew, was not luck. It was awareness. They had learned how to read the battlefield, the smell of burning fuel, the echo of distant engines, the sharp whine of a German 88 round before it hit. Hanley could tell a panzer's direction by the sound of its treads. Delaney could estimate distance from muzzle flash alone. These instincts had been earned the hard way. One burnt-out village, one near death at a time. Still, the crew knew what they were up against. The Sherman's armor could not match a Tiger's. Its gun was underpowered against thick German steel. The odds were always the same, uneven. But what they had was mobility, teamwork, and imagination. The Americans had turned these traits into weapons. When Hanley ordered the tank painted black, no one questioned him. They understood without words. Deception was their only armor now. As the minutes before dawn stretched thin, Delaney adjusted the gun's elevation. Turner stacked the shells in ready sequence, armor-piercing first, high-explosive second. Ramirez listened to the road outside, his ears tuned to vibration more than sound. Hanley lowered the periscope and scanned the tree line. A flicker of headlights appeared, gliding between branches. German trucks, at least half a dozen, maybe more. He didn't speak. He only raised a single hand, steady, waiting, and the crew froze, eyes on him. The hunt was about to begin. In the early hours of December 27, 1944, German supply convoys crept through the Ardennes forest like metal snakes in the dark. Their engines muttered low, gears shifting cautiously to avoid drawing Allied aircraft, though the skies were clear of bombers now, grounded by snow and fog. The men at the wheels were exhausted, their faces grey from lack of sleep and smoke inhalation. They had been driving for nearly 48 hours, pushing west toward the Meuse. Fuel was their lifeblood. Without it, even the mighty Tiger tanks of the 2nd Panzer Division would be nothing more than steel monuments in the mud. The offensive depended entirely on convoys like this. Hundreds of trucks and tankers moving under the cover of night, weaving through frozen villages and pine corridors. Each carried precious gasoline, ammunition, and food for the advancing units. Corporal Klaus Wirtz, a driver in one of those Opel Blitz trucks, clutched the wheel with stiff hands, his breath fogging the windshield. The convoy's orders were simple. No lights, no stops, no chatter. Only the lead truck ran a slit of dim yellow under blackout covers. Every man in the column knew the risk. American ambushes had become frequent, small, brutal, and invisible until the first shell struck. The terrain offered both concealment and danger. Tall pines hemmed in the road, and snowdrifts masked the ditches. The moon hid behind thick clouds. The road wound through a shallow valley, a natural funnel that forced every vehicle into a narrow path. It was the kind of place where one disabled truck could block an entire column. But Wirtz and his comrades had no choice. The division's armored spearhead near St. Vith was burning fuel faster than expected. If they didn't reach the front by morning, entire battalions would stall. And with Luftwaffe support almost non-existent, no one could afford delays. In the middle of the line, a Panzer IV escort tank rumbled forward, its commander scanning the tree line through frosted goggles. The forest was silent, too silent. No artillery, no patrols, only the occasional crack of ice under a tire. For a fleeting moment, Wirtz thought he saw something, a dark mass among the trees, motionless, as if watching. But when he blinked, it was gone. Probably a stump, he told himself. Just shadow on snow. The convoy pressed on. Their headlights flickered against the fog, a moving rhythm of pale light and darkness. A few hundred meters ahead, hidden beneath that same fog, Sergeant Hanley's black-painted Sherman sat perfectly still, its turret angled, its barrel fixed on the road. The prey had entered the trap. Nothing about Hanley's plan was textbook. It wasn't written in any field manual, and no commanding officer would have officially approved it. But on the Ardennes front in late December 1944, necessity had replaced doctrine. Every soldier who survived those weeks understood. Improvisation was the only constant. Radios failed, maps froze solid, and orders rarely reached the right units. Cut off and surrounded, isolated platoons and tank crews fought on instinct, not command. And from that chaos emerged some of the most creative tactics of the war. The decision to paint the Sherman black wasn't madness. It was adaptation, the kind born of desperation and experience. Hanley had seen how the snow betrayed every shadow of green and brown. A tank in motion left a trail of contrast, visible from hundreds of meters away. But black paint, scavenged from an abandoned German maintenance shed, could turn the tank into a silhouette, swallowed by the forest's own darkness. This was not the first time American armor had improvised in the field. Earlier in the campaign, crews had welded extra steel plating scavenged from wrecked vehicles onto their tanks. Others had mounted logs, sandbags, or even concrete to absorb the impact of an 88mm shell. A few units went further, disguising their vehicles as wrecks, farm machinery, or static defenses to lure German armor into close range. Each solution carried risk, but it kept men alive. Hanley's crew represented the essence of that spirit. They were ordinary soldiers, forced to outthink an army that had for years dominated European armor warfare. The Germans had precision and experience, but the Americans had creativity and numbers. By late 1944, the US war machine had become a vast factory of innovation, from radar-guided artillery to modular bridging units and flamethrower Shermans. Yet on the front lines, the most effective ideas still came from the men in the mud. While the black paint dried, Hanley reflected on how far they'd come since Normandy. There, camouflage had meant brush and netting. Here it meant survival through invisibility. The forest had become their ally. In the rear of the Sherman, the tank's diesel engine ticked faintly in the cold. The paint shimmered dull in the moonlight, uneven but effective. From 10 meters away, it was impossible to tell where the tank ended and the forest began. It wasn't elegant. It was brutal, simple and American. A field-born trick that turned weakness into advantage. They didn't know if it would work. But as Hanley lowered his periscope and spotted the first flicker of headlights, he realized something. The best ideas in war were often the ones no one ever planned. The German convoy was moving closer now, gears grinding, tires crunching ice. The trap, improvised or not, was ready. The forest was utterly still. Every branch, every ridge, every hollow seemed to hold its breath. The only sound inside the Sherman was the faint crackle of frost shifting across the steel hull. Hanley checked his watch again, 04:10. The convoy was close. "Engines off," he whispered. The words carried more weight than a shout. The motor died into silence, and the crew sat in darkness lit only by the dim red glow of a covered bulb. Outside, the night pressed in like a living thing. The paint they had brushed onto the tank hours before had hardened, dull and invisible under the starless sky. The black surface absorbed what little light the snow reflected, turning the tank into a hole in the landscape. Each man had his ritual before combat. Turner, the loader, touched the shell casing stacked beside him. 5 armor-piercing, 4 high-explosive, 1 smoke. Ramirez kept his hand on the ignition lever, thumb trembling slightly against the metal. Delaney steadied his breath, squinting through the gun sight, adjusting the elevation 1 millimeter at a time. Hanley said nothing. He just listened. The wind carried faint vibrations through the ground, a rhythmic tremor of engines and wheels. The Germans were coming slower than expected. Maybe they were cautious, maybe exhausted. Either way, that gave the Americans time. Hanley reached for his field glasses and peered through the slit in the turret. Between the trees, faint glows of headlights moved in a broken line, their beams bouncing off the mist. 6 trucks, maybe 7, 1 Panzer escort at the rear. The convoy's outline blurred in the fog, shadows sliding through deeper shadows. The smell of oil and snow filled the Sherman. It was the same smell they'd lived with since Normandy, a mixture of steel, cordite, and fear. Turner shifted his boots, careful not to let them scrape the metal floor. Every movement, every breath mattered. Hanley mentally walked through the plan again. Wait until the lead truck passed the fallen pine they'd marked earlier. That was the signal range. Delaney would fire 1 armor-piercing round into the lead vehicle, sealing the road. Then the second into the rear escort. 2 shots, 2 explosions. No escape. After that, the rest would be instinct. The men said nothing. They didn't need to. Months of fighting had taught them each other's timing, their rhythm. A kind of silent language formed in the noise of war. A whisper of wind passed through the trees, carrying the smell of diesel exhaust closer. Hanley's gloved hand tightened on the turret rim. "Get ready," he murmured. The first faint shape of the German convoy broke through the fog. Headlights flickered across the trees, painting ghostly streaks across the snow. Inside the Sherman, 5 hearts beat in unison, steady and cold. The moment was near. Time slowed to a crawl inside the Sherman. Each second stretched until it felt like a minute, each breath like a risk. The forest outside was alive now, faint vibrations running through the frozen ground as engines murmured in the distance. Somewhere ahead, the convoy's lead truck downshifted, gears grinding softly against the stillness. Hanley's hand hovered near the periscope, his pulse steady but sharp. He'd fought long enough to recognize that strange calm before violence, the moment when instinct overtook fear. Inside the tank it was warm from body heat, thick with the smell of diesel and gunmetal. Breath fogged against the steel walls, slowly fading into condensation. Ramirez's foot rested lightly on the starter, his other hand gripping the control lever. Turner crouched beside the ammunition racks, eyes flicking over the shells in order. Armor-piercing, high-explosive smoke, the sequence drilled into him like prayer. Delaney's face was lit by the faint red glow of the sighting lamp, one eye pressed against the scope, his other closed in focus. Hanley lowered himself slightly, keeping his voice just above a whisper. "Remember, lead truck, then the rear. No second chances." Delaney nodded, jaw tight. The waiting was worse than the fight. Out there in the freezing air, the Germans rolled forward unaware. Each truck carried barrels of fuel, crates of ammunition, and men huddled in their greatcoats, thinking only of warmth and movement. None of them expected a Sherman to be hiding 20 yards off the road, camouflaged in darkness, silent as the snow itself. The convoy came into clearer view, black outlines moving between pines. The fog thickened, breaking the headlights into beams that seemed to drift through smoke. The first truck crawled forward, followed by the second, third, and fourth. A Panzer IV rumbled somewhere behind them, its turret slowly panning left to right. Inside the Sherman, not a word was spoken, only breath and heartbeat. Hanley watched as the lead truck crossed the fallen pine, their mark. He waited for the second, then the third. The range was perfect. He raised 2 fingers. Delaney's hand tightened on the trigger assembly. "Fire 1, Hanley whispered. The 75mm gun roared. The recoil slammed through the hull like a hammer blow. The round struck the lead truck dead center, and the night erupted in orange flame. The explosion rolled through the forest, bouncing off the snow-covered hills in a wave of light and thunder. The convoy froze. Men shouted in German. Brakes screeched. Headlights swung wildly across the trees. Hanley didn't wait. "Rear vehicle!" The second shell fired. The explosion at the back of the column cut off the retreat, sealing the road in a wall of burning wreckage. Now they were trapped, caught in the narrow stretch with nowhere to run. Inside the Sherman, Turner was already loading the next shell. Hanley's voice stayed calm, precise, mechanical. High explosive. Hit the middle trucks. The night of waiting had ended. The ambush had begun. The first detonation tore through the stillness like a thunderclap. The lead truck vanished in a bloom of fire and shrapnel, its fuel load igniting in an orange-white blossom that turned the forest into daylight for an instant. Heat rippled through the trees, snow vaporized off branches, and the convoy's disciplined order dissolved into panic. German drivers hit their brakes too late. The second explosion from the rear vehicle trapped the rest in a corridor of flame. Tires screamed against ice. A half-track tried to swerve into the ditch and sank, its track spinning uselessly. The acrid smell of burning fuel rolled through the fog, thick and bitter. Inside the Sherman, the concussion of each shot echoed through the hull, rattling bolts loose from the turret ring. Delaney adjusted the sight, his gloved hands steady despite the vibration. Turner slammed another shell into the breech, a high explosive, and slapped the casing twice. Up, middle truck. Range 200, Hanley said flatly. The gun barked again. A shockwave punched through the forest. The shell struck the convoy's center, splitting a flatbed loaded with ammunition. A chain of explosions rippled down the line, crates of shells cooking off one after another, sending flashes of light and jagged fragments slicing through the fog. Through the periscope, Hanley saw silhouettes flailing between the trucks, German soldiers diving for cover, some firing blindly into the trees. Muzzle flashes lit their outlines, brief and ghostly. The air filled with the stutter of MG-42s, their tracers cutting bright orange threads through the smoke. Traverse left, Hanley barked. The turret groaned as Delaney rotated. Ramirez gunned the starter. The Sherman lurched forward, repositioning behind a mound of snow. Rounds pinged against its armor, ricocheting into the dark. One struck the side hatch with a ringing metallic scream. They were under return fire now. Somewhere in the convoy, a German half-track's cannon opened up, hammering the forest with 20mm shells. Branches shattered overhead. Bark exploded from trees. The sound was deafening, like being inside a drum filled with thunder, AP ready. Turner shouted. Hanley glanced through the sight, a shadow of a Panzer IV emerging through the smoke, its turret turning toward them. That's our mark. Hold! The world seemed to pause. The Panzer's gun flashed first, a white tongue of light, and the shell screamed past the Sherman's turret, missing by inches. Snow erupted beside them. Fire! Delaney's round left the barrel with a deafening roar. The tracer streaked through smoke and hit the Panzer's lower hull. Sparks burst, followed by a plume of smoke, a partial penetration. The German tank shuddered but didn't stop. Again, Turner slammed another shell in. Delaney fired before Hanley could finish speaking. This time the shot struck under the turret ring. The explosion was immediate, violent. The Panzer's hatch blew open, flames spilling out as the turret froze mid-turn. The crew didn't cheer. There was no time. More movement flickered ahead, German infantry scattering toward the tree line, others firing into the night. Hanley steadied his breath. The ambush had achieved surprise, but now survival depended on ending it fast. They were no longer hidden. The hunt had begun in both directions. For the next 30 seconds, the forest became a storm of fire and sound. Flames from the burning trucks clawed at the trees, painting the fog in orange light. Shadows of running men darted between the vehicles, some carrying rifles, others stumbling, clothes smoldering from the heat. The air stank of fuel and cordite, of splintered wood and scorched rubber. Inside the Sherman, every sense was heightened. The tank shook with each shot, brass casings clattering to the floor like spent breath. Delaney's world had shrunk to the sight reticle, smoke, distance, movement. Turner's hands worked automatically, his fingers black with soot. Ramirez's face was a mask of concentration, his ears ringing from the constant concussion. Hanley stayed silent except for orders. Truck left. Range 150. Boom. Next one behind it. Boom. The rhythm became mechanical. Target, fire, reload. The gun roared, the recoil slammed, the next shell went in. They could see nothing clearly, only flashes between the smoke. In the convoy, German soldiers tried to return fire, crouched behind wrecked vehicles. A few opened up with MG-42s, their bursts tearing through the lower branches. Tracers raked the Sherman's flank, sparking harmlessly off armor. One truck driver, his uniform on fire, stumbled into the road and collapsed beside a wheel still spinning. Hanley knew the pattern. After the first shock, confusion would give way to coordination. The Germans would reorganize. And somewhere out of sight they would call for help. There was no way to hold this position once that happened. He turned to Ramirez. "Back her up 5 yards. Use the smoke from the wrecks as cover." The driver shifted gears, easing the Sherman into reverse. Its treads crushed through frozen brush, the black hull sliding deeper into shadow. To anyone looking from the road, it was a phantom, flickering between flame and darkness. Another explosion rocked the valley, ammunition from the central truck finally detonating. A fountain of fire shot skyward, raining metal fragments that hissed in the snow. The shockwave punched the Sherman's hull, knocking dust loose from its rivets. Through his scope, Delaney spotted movement, a group of Germans forming near the rear, trying to pull an anti-tank weapon from a truck bed. "Hanley, they're setting up a Panzerfaust." Hanley's voice came instantly. "He round. Fire before they lock." The 75mm barked one more time. The shell hit the road just short of the group. The explosion tore through men and crates alike. The Panzerfaust vanished in a spray of dirt and light. Silence returned, brief, uneasy. Only crackling fires and the hiss of cooling metal remained. The forest glowed in alternating bands of orange and black. Hanley watched through the periscope, scanning for movement. "That's enough. They'll have artillery zeroed here in minutes." Turner's hands trembled from exhaustion. Delaney leaned back from the scope, blinking through sweat and grime. Ramirez kept the engine idling, ready to move. They had done what they came for. The convoy was gone, supply lines severed, the German push delayed. But survival meant leaving now, before the forest itself turned against them. Hanley glanced once more at the burning wrecks, a dozen trucks, a ruined Panzer, the road choked with debris. Then he said quietly, "We're done. Pull us out." The Sherman lurched backward into the woods, its blackened hull melting into the night from which it had struck. They had bought seconds of silence, no more. The first retaliatory shell screamed in from the north, exploding somewhere behind them with a thunderous crack that shook the trees. Snow and soil rained down across the Sherman's armor. The Germans were already reacting, blind firing into the fog, trying to flush out the invisible attacker that had shattered their column. "Artillery!" Ramirez shouted over the din, gripping the controls. "Stay low, keep her moving." Hanley snapped, voice calm but sharp. Another shell detonated closer. The blast rolled through the forest like a giant's fist, scattering branches, splinters, and flaming debris. The roar of enemy half-tracks joined the chaos, their machine guns spraying into the trees. Tracers sliced through smoke, some bouncing off the Sherman's hull with sharp metallic rings. Delaney swiveled the turret toward the flashes. 2 half-tracks, both firing blind. "Don't waste the big gun," Hanley said. "We're not sticking around to duel." The Sherman crawled backward over snow and broken brush, its treads grinding softly to avoid throwing sparks. In the darkness behind them, a pine tree collapsed in flames, illuminating their path for an instant. The light caught their tank, black, glistening, ghost-like, before they disappeared back into shadow. Hanley's plan now was simple: fade back into the forest, use the smoke and terrain to mask their retreat. The ambush had worked, brilliantly, brutally, but staying meant death. Inside the German column, panic had turned to organized fury. Surviving troops regrouped behind wrecks, shouting orders. A 2nd Panzer IV was moving into position, its turret turning toward where the Sherman had last fired. German infantry fanned out on both sides of the road, sweeping their rifles through the woods, firing into every shape and shadow. Then came the whine of engines. Somewhere above, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane circled, low, searching for targets. Hanley knew what that meant. If they were spotted, German artillery would follow within minutes. "Ramirez," he said evenly, "take us through that gully east. We'll lose them in the trees." The driver nodded, shifting gears. The Sherman rumbled down a slope, snow crunching under its weight. Branches scraped across the turret with a hollow screech. Turner steadied himself, one hand gripping the side rail, the other clutching the last shell. Another explosion erupted behind them, this time a direct hit on the wrecked convoy. The entire horizon flared as fuel barrels cooked off, sending shockwaves through the ground. Flames clawed 20 feet into the air, casting wild, dancing shadows across the forest. Hanley turned the periscope backward. The road they'd ambushed was now a tunnel of fire and twisted metal. The German panzer's silhouette was barely visible through the haze, turning its gun left and right like a blind hunter. "Keep going," he murmured. "Don't stop for anything." They plunged deeper into the snow-draped forest, guided only by instinct and the faint compass of memory. The tank creaked and groaned as it forced its way through frozen undergrowth. Inside, no one spoke. Behind them, the German shells continued to fall, each one landing farther from the road, as if the enemy was striking at ghosts. The crew of the Sherman vanished into the same darkness that had birthed their ambush, leaving behind only fire, wreckage, and confusion. In the command tents miles away, German officers would argue for hours over what had struck them, a rogue platoon, an airstrike, or a phantom tank. None would believe it was one crew, one idea, and a few gallons of stolen paint. The forest swallowed them whole. The deeper they moved, the darker it became. An endless labyrinth of pines, smoke, and silence broken only by the Sherman's low engine hum. Snow muffled their passage, covering the tank's tracks as quickly as they were made. Somewhere behind them, the horizon still flickered with the glow of the burning convoy, a false dawn rising out of destruction. Inside the tank, the adrenaline was fading, replaced by exhaustion and the dull ache that followed survival. Turner leaned against the ammo rack, his gloves blackened, his breath shallow. Delaney wiped soot from his eyes with the back of his hand. Ramirez's knuckles were white on the control sticks, every muscle locked in tension. Hanley sat in the commander's seat, peering through the periscope as if the steel around him might suddenly dissolve. He knew the danger wasn't over. German patrols would spread through the woods soon, hunting the ghost tank that had struck their lifeline. They reached a small clearing, a frozen stream running through it like a vein of glass. Hanley raised his hand. "Hold here." The Sherman settled into the snow with a soft sigh. Steam rose from its exhaust, curling into the trees. The men waited, listening. In the distance, faint pops echoed. Rifle fire, maybe artillery far off, maybe nothing. The Ardennes swallowed sound the way it swallowed men. Turner broke the silence first. "We've got one shell left," he said quietly, tapping the crate beside him. "Just one." Hanley nodded. "Keep it loaded." "Just in case." Delaney stared through the sight, scanning the tree line. "Think they'll come this far?" "They'll try," Hanley said. "They'll think we're still near the road. We'll stay put until nightfall, then head west." He checked his map, lit faintly by a red-filtered lamp. Their position was barely 5 miles from friendly lines, but distance meant little in the Ardennes. The forest was a maze of dead ends, cliffs, and hidden ravines. Every wrong turn could lead straight into a German unit. Minutes passed. Snow began to fall again, gently, silently. The flakes landed on the Sherman's black paint, softening its edges, erasing its presence. Within minutes, the tank looked less like a machine and more like a mound of shadow. Hanley exhaled slowly. "That's the best camouflage we'll get." He closed his eyes for a moment, not to rest but to remember how stillness felt before the next storm. Around him, the men said nothing. Words were unnecessary. They all understood what they had done, what they had survived. The last shell sat waiting in the breach, cold and patient. In war, there was always one more shot that might matter, and one more night to live through. When dawn finally broke, it was pale and cold, the kind of light that carried no warmth, only exposure. The snow had stopped, leaving a grey silence over the forest. Through the mist, columns of smoke rose like black pillars where the German convoy had burned. Even miles away, the smell of it lingered, acrid, oily, unmistakably human. Hanley and his crew emerged cautiously from the Sherman, their boots sinking into the soft crust of snow. For the first time in hours, they could stretch their limbs, breathe air that wasn't mixed with fumes and powder. Frost clung to their jackets, their faces streaked with grime and exhaustion. None of them spoke. From their vantage point, they could see the valley below, a thin strip of road now choked with twisted metal and charred husks. Trucks lay overturned, half buried in snow and smoke. The panzer that had pursued them sat lifeless, its gun drooping, black scars cut deep into its hull. The forest, once pristine and white, was scarred by fire. It was a battlefield reduced to silence. The dead lay scattered, indistinct shapes against the snow, faces already pale and still. Hanley's men watched in silence, each caught in his own thoughts. Victory in war never felt like triumph. It felt like endurance, survival without celebration. Turner broke the stillness first. "You think anyone made it out of that?" Hanley lowered his binoculars, his breath curling in the cold air. Some, maybe, but they won't forget it. He knew what that meant. For every truck lost, for every tank burned, an entire section of the German offensive would stall. Without fuel, the armored columns grinding toward Bastogne would slow. Without supplies, their attack would falter. Small actions, single ambushes like theirs, were what turned the tide of the Ardennes. In later reports, commanders would barely note it. Enemy convoy destroyed near Trois-Ponts by unknown armored element. A single line in 1,000 pages. No mention of the black paint, or the men who risked everything on an idea that shouldn't have worked. But Hanley didn't care for reports. He only cared that his men were alive, that for one more day they had endured what so many hadn't. Delaney leaned against the Sherman's hull, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. "Looks like we bought them some time." Hanley nodded slowly, his eyes still on the horizon. "Time's all anyone buys out here." The sun crept higher, cutting through the mist, revealing the tank's uneven coat of black paint, streaked, chipped, and now flecked with white snow. A crude disguise born of desperation that had changed the course of a morning. In the distance, faint echoes of artillery rolled across the hills, the war moving onward, indifferent and endless. Hanley climbed back onto the Sherman, brushing snow from the hatch. "Mount up. We've got a long way to go." The crew obeyed without a word. The engine coughed, then caught, the familiar rumble filling the quiet once more. As they turned west toward friendly lines, the rising sun glinted off their tank's battered armor, a reminder that survival was not victory. But it was enough. Behind them, the smoke drifted higher, carrying the memory of one impossible night when 4 men, a tank, and a stolen can of paint changed the rhythm of a battle. By the time Hanley's Sherman rolled back into the American perimeter near Webermont that afternoon, the battle map of the Ardennes had already shifted. German fuel shortages were mounting. Several armored spearheads had ground to a halt just miles short of their objectives. No one on the front lines would ever know exactly which broken convoys had caused it, but somewhere among those smoking wrecks lay the ripples of what one tank crew had done. When Hanley's unit reached the forward command post, their tank looked like something dragged out of a nightmare, blackened, dented, its paint streaked with soot and snow. An officer emerged from a tent, squinting at them as if unsure what he was seeing. "Where in hell have you boys been?" Hanley didn't answer at first. He just climbed down, boots sinking into the slush, and handed over a brief field report scribbled in pencil on a ration box. It was 2 paragraphs long. Engaged and destroyed enemy convoy along secondary forest road near Trois-Ponts. Confirmed at least 6 trucks and 1 Panzer IV. Withdrew before counterfire. No losses. The officer read it twice, then looked up. "How many of you?" 4, Hanley said simply. There would be no medals for this kind of work. No photographers, no generals shaking hands. Their story would dissolve into the broader chaos of the Bulge, buried under the headlines of Bastogne and Patton's advance. But among the armored ranks, word traveled fast. Tales whispered over mess tins and cigarette smoke, a black-painted Sherman that struck from the dark. A tank that vanished into the forest before anyone could find it. Some swore it was from the 2nd Armored Division, others said the 7th. None could prove it. But every retelling grew into legend. The kind soldiers told each other not to boast, but to believe that ingenuity still mattered. In the following weeks, several crews tried variations of the same trick. Some smeared mud across their hulls to dull the shine. Others rigged sheets of canvas painted grey to blend with snowbanks. Improvisation became survival doctrine. The black paint of Hanley's Sherman had become more than camouflage. It was an idea, passed from crew to crew, division to division. Reports from the German side reflected the confusion. Intelligence summaries spoke of enemy armor units employing unorthodox concealment, of phantom tanks striking under cover of darkness. Entire sections of supply routes were rerouted, convoys delayed, resources stretched thinner still. Hanley never heard any of it. His crew spent the next days refueling, resupplying and moving to new positions along the frozen line. For them, it was another mission completed. Another page turned in a war that refused to end. But somewhere in the Army's vast network of reports, buried among logistics updates and casualty lists, one line stood out: enemy supply disruption confirmed. Localized action attributed to unidentified U.S. armored element. Tactical success achieved through improvised concealment. It was a footnote to most. But for 4 men, it was proof that sometimes the smallest spark, even one painted black, could throw a shadow big enough to change the field of war. Long after the fires of the Ardennes cooled, the story of that nameless Sherman faded into the fog of history, but its lesson endured. In war, brilliance rarely came from laboratories or command tables. It was born in mud under pressure, in the hands of men who refused to die by the book. By the spring of 1945, the tide in Europe had turned completely. The German counteroffensive collapsed, and Allied forces surged east toward the Rhine. Fuel convoys that once roared with confidence now limped or never came at all. German armor, once the terror of Europe, often stood idle for lack of gasoline, its hulks abandoned beside frozen roads. Every destroyed supply line, every delayed truck mattered. The great machines of war lived or died by the smallest interruptions. When post-war historians mapped the Battle of the Bulge, they drew sweeping arrows across the Ardennes, marking divisions, movements, and breakthroughs. But on no map would you find the single forest road near Trois-Ponts, or the 4 Americans who decided that a can of black paint might buy one more day of survival. Their act was simple. Paint, patience, precision, yet it reflected the heart of an army that learned faster than its enemies. From Normandy's beaches to the hedgerows of France, from frozen Bastogne to the heart of Germany, the US Army's strength was never only in numbers or machines. It was in adaptation, the quiet genius of soldiers who bent the impossible until it broke. The black-painted Sherman became a small legend among tankers, told in fragments and whispers. Some said it was destroyed days later in a counterattack. Others claimed it returned to action at the Rhine crossings. The truth was probably somewhere between, as it always is in war. But what mattered wasn't the ending. It was the idea that camouflage paint, frozen breath, a handful of men who refused to surrender the initiative. That moment on a cold December night had echoed through 1,000 future battles, from Korea's frozen ridges to the deserts of Iraq, where soldiers would again find themselves alone, outnumbered, and forced to invent their own salvation. As the years passed, Hanley and his crew went back to their lives. They never wrote memoirs. They never spoke to journalists. Their war had been personal, fought one freezing dawn at a time. But deep in the archives of the US Army, a faded photograph remains. A Sherman tank coated in rough black paint, parked in a clearing surrounded by trees. No caption, no names. Only a date, Ardennes, December 1944. The camera caught the snow melting on its hull, the dark streaks running like tears down steel. To most it was another relic. To those who knew, it was something else entirely. Proof that even in the darkest hours of the war, human ingenuity could still burn brighter than any fire. And on that frozen morning, when one American tank disappeared into the night and struck from the shadows, it wasn't just an ambush. It was a message, written not in words but in smoke and steel, that courage and invention are sometimes the same thing.